Good afternoon, everyone. It seems that people are now trickling in, so let's get started. Thank you, first of all, for joining us for what I think is going to be not only an interesting but an important discussion about responding to and recovering from the pandemic. My name is Andy Smarick, and I'm going to be moderating today. I'm a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute, but for the current conversation, what might be more relevant is I've now worked for 7 different government entities. So I have a tendency now to think of all things in terms of policy, as I like to think about it. What can various state entities do to enable citizens and institutions to respond to problems and to capitalize on opportunities? And I suspect, based on the folks who are at this conference, that many of you are probably, who are tuning into this session, you think along the exact same lines. We're all watching this potential crisis unfold, and we have to figure out how in the world we can head it off, or if that's not possible, address it as quickly and as effectively as humanly possible. So to put a fine point on it, COVID and the subsequent lockdown will have, we suspect, serious and probably lasting consequences for student achievement and beyond. So earnings, attainment, so forth. So that's why this panel we've titled From Predicting to Preventing, Avoiding Learning and Economic Losses from Becoming Reality, because we're seeing what can be done in advance of these things becoming a reality. So we have 4 excellent presenters who are going to help us work through all of these issues. They've been studying how schools and school systems have responded so far, everything from getting back to opening schools to online learning and so forth. And they also come with some initial insights into how the last 9 months or so have affected students, and probably most importantly of all, what effects could very well be on the horizon in the months or even years ahead. So, as I see it, I just have 3 jobs over the next hour, and the first one is stepping out of the way so all 4 of these accomplished people can explain what their research has revealed. So each of the 4 panelists are going to have 5 or so minutes to present what they've learned and to share it with all of you. My second job is I just want to make sure that we are all clear on the most important findings, so I may be a little bit of a nag and pester and ask quick follow-up questions just so we can clarify the key points involved. And then maybe most interestingly for those of you who are watching, this third and final point is I'm going to try to pivot us towards the second half of the conversation to what policymakers and practitioners could possibly do now and then in the weeks and months ahead. So my goal is, for those of you who are watching this, I want you to be able to leave the session feeling like you understand what the educational consequences of COVID and the lockdown have been, but also feeling like you have some sort of outline of a to-do list, regardless of what your job is, state legislator, working for State Department of Education, philanthropy, or something else. Okay, so our panelists, and this is in the order that they will present. First up will be Emma Dorn, Global Education Practice Manager at McKinsey and Company. Next is going to be John Friedman. He's a professor at Brown University and co-director of the Opportunity Insights. Third will be Nat Malkus, a resident scholar and Deputy Director of Education Policy Studies at AEI, the American Enterprise Institute. And last but certainly not least is Robin Lake, Director of the Center on Reinventing Public Education. So Emma, would you like to kick things off and get us started, please?
Sure, absolutely. So hopefully folks can see my screen. I would like to talk a little bit about the data around student learning loss through COVID. So back in the spring, McKinsey published a study which projected what might the student learning loss be due to COVID based on historical studies of summer slide and summer learning loss. And then we tried to translate that into what the impact would be on GDP and on student earnings. Well, now it's the fall and we actually have initial assessment data where we can tell what have students lost already. And what are districts and states doing to try and close opportunity gaps to stem that tide of learning? And so today I'm actually going to present fresh new material that hasn't been published. We're going to be publishing this on December the 8th in a new report that really looks at what the disparities are so far and what can be done about it. So 1 second. There you go. So the first message really is that tangible learning loss has already occurred. And the data here is data from Curriculum Associates' iReady platform, and their full assessment data as students return to school in the fall. And these are the in-school assessments that Curriculum Associates did. And what we can see here is that in reading, the loss was actually not as much as some people predicted. And so on average, students learned about 87%, and that's that middle dotted line, of the reading that they would learn in a normal year. In math, however, the loss was greater. In math, students learned about 67% of the math content that they would normally have learned in a year. The second thing we can see is that there are big disparities between schools. So the data that we received really looked at the data at the school level. And we can see that schools with greater than 50% students of color, those are the black dots, performed less well than schools with greater than 50% white students, which really reflects underlying opportunity gaps at some of those schools. So for example, in math, there's a 10-point difference where schools with 50% students of color, on average, those students had only learned 59% of a normal year's content, whereas schools with greater than 50% white students had learned 69%. There's then a little bit of nuance around how that differs by grade, but there are disparities across all of the different grade levels. And I think that what this really reflects is, especially in the spring, as districts were scrambling to get things up and running, a lot of students didn't have access. A lot of districts weren't able to get remote learning up and running. And so hopefully in the fall, we're in a better position. And so the next thing we took a quick look at is how have things changed since the spring in terms of that opportunity? And then what might that mean for our projections going forwards? So I'll go through these next couple of slides quite quickly. These are based on US Census Household Pulse Survey. And what we can see is that gaps in access have really narrowed since the spring. So a lot of districts and states put in a big effort to improve access to internet-enabled learning devices and improve actual access to the internet itself. And so you can see these lines here. The blue line is white students, the gray line is Hispanic students, and the black line is Black students. And the gaps have really narrowed, but they still remain. Similarly, if you look at the learning modalities that students are in, what we can see, and this is a projection of how students started the school year based upon a number of sources, which we then extrapolated to the full US. And based on our estimates, we estimated that about 50% of white students were fully remote, whereas around 70% of Black and Hispanic students were fully remote. And I know there have been multiple different analyses of this, but pretty much every single one has come up with a similar story, that Black and Hispanic students are more likely to be in fully remote learning than white students. And then even if students are remote, the access that they have to live teachers looks quite different. And again, this is the census data. And this basically shows how often in the last week a student had access to live contact with teachers. And what we see here is that white students, about 8%, really had no access at all to live contact with teachers. No phone calls, nothing in person, no video, no Zoom, no nothing. Whereas Black and Hispanic students, that's about double, 15 to 16%, nothing, no contact with teachers. And this is in October. So these opportunity gaps still remain. The good news is that there's a good chunk of kids who are getting real live instruction most every day of the week. So then the next thing we wanted to do is take a look forwards and say, well, what does this mean for the total learning loss that we're going to expect due to the pandemic, and revise our expectations? And so we created 4 scenarios. The first scenario is what would happen if we just extrapolated the spring. And we said everything was going to be as bad as it was in the spring. And we're hoping this is a bullet that we've dodged, right? We're hoping that we have improved things since the spring. But if we just extrapolated the trends from the spring, what we see is that on average, students will have lost 10 months of learning. And this is of a 10-month school year. So that translates into a year of learning loss in mathematics. Now, obviously, in reading, those numbers would be smaller. The disparities are quite stark. White students will have lost 5 to 9 months. Students of color could have lost 12 to 16 months. Now, as we have talked about, things have improved since the spring. So the second scenario we created was the status quo scenario. This is pretty much where we are today. This is assuming everyone stays in their current modalities of hybrid, in-person, or remote. And there's a mix of remote learning quality, and there's some students who are still falling through the cracks. And with this, on average, we think that students will lose about 9 months of mathematics learning. Now, there are things that can be done to minimize this number. The first, obviously, is to improve the quality of remote and hybrid learning. And if we manage to get all students receiving the equivalent of the top 2 quintiles of remote and hybrid learning from virtual schools historically, then we would see an average learning loss of 6 months. And then, of course, the other thing that we can think about doing is getting students back to school safely with the right health safeguards in place. And if we could get students back to school in January, then the total amount of learning loss would be about 5 months. And so just to summarize across all of those slides, if we do nothing, the average loss looks about 9 months. If we start to get students back into schools or improve remote learning, it could be 5 to 6. But even in our best case scenarios, that means students are going to start the next school year half a school year behind. And so we really need to be thinking about what are the acceleration strategies to support those students, especially in mathematics. And we don't even know about social sciences and science. We know that reading looks a little less bad and that mathematics looks worse, but we haven't even measured some of these other things. But we do know that acceleration strategies will be needed. And hopefully in the latter half of this conversation, we can talk about what some of those are as well. But with that, I'll hand it back to Andy.
No, that's great. Let me just ask one follow-up question, and this could be for you or maybe someone else can weigh in later on, which is the racial disparities. Do we know how much of that, so for example, the percentage of Black and Latino kids who are in online or full-time in-person learning, how much of that is a function of big urban school districts primarily being less likely to be open than, say, rural school districts? So is this primarily a geographic issue that we're dealing with, or is this national? So like if you controlled for geography, we would still see these kinds of disparities. Do we know the answer to that yet?
So Chalkbeat did an interesting analysis where it actually did control for type of school district, and it showed even within urban, suburban, and rural districts that had greater proportions of Black and Hispanic students were more likely to be remote.
So this is
a thing comparing between schools within the same county, which in many cases are the same school district, and you get those same disparities. So my sense is that this is really something that's happening at the school level, not just about different types of students being in different types of places.
So this is a hugely important point, I think, for policymakers to realize. So this isn't a problem that could just be solved by making sure America's 20th largest school districts got their doors open. This is a state by state, county by county, district by district, even school by school issue. So actually that's a very good segue. John, do you want to take it from here?
Sure. Let me share my screen here. Great. So let me just start by talking about the data that I've been analyzing. This is somewhat similar to what Emma showed. These are weekly data from an online math curriculum tool called Zern, which about 1 million students in grades 1 through 5 across the country use, not just as an add-on, but as part of their daily and weekly routines. And so what that allows us to do at the school level is actually establish a baseline of usage, which is kind of what you see here. We establish a baseline, and then we can see what happens week by week when the COVID-19 pandemic hits and how it's affecting different types of students. So, it's not subtle. When the pandemic hits, you see really sharp declines in engagement from students in really all different groups. I've split it here by income quartile. This is using the free and reduced price lunch fraction in each school. And what you see is that the pandemic, as Emma was talking about along racial lines, the pandemic really affected different types of kids differently, where students in this light blue line who are in schools serving more affluent students on average, they were affected, about 25% drop when everything suddenly went remote in mid-March. But then over the next few weeks, they actually climbed back to basically return to the average that they showed pre-pandemic, before I cut it off at the end of April, because then schools just stop using it at the end of the year as the curriculum winds up. In contrast, you see schools at lower income schools having much steeper declines when the pandemic hit, and then recovering much less sharply, such that even by the time we got to kind of the height of the recovery educationally in mid-April, they were really only about half where they were in terms of student engagement. And so this is evidence directly on how the pandemic is really widening, not only affecting students on average, but really widening existing inequalities in the system. Now, how did this look like when students came back in the fall? So here we have a summer break, and then we pick it back up when most schools are back in session in mid-September. And as you can see, the picture is much better. We see much less of a gap between schools here, but there's still a noticeable gap, about a 10 to 15% deficit that we see. Students in lower and middle income schools are still not quite getting back to where they were before the pandemic. You can also make this comparison to where they were in September and October last year, kind of a year-on-year comparison. You get something very similar. And so this suggests that we've kind of done better, but still we are, these inequalities persist. And what's, I think, clear is that not only are things not getting better as we've gone on through the school year, things actually seem to be getting worse. And I'll come back to part of why I think that's happening in a second. Now, these are national data. And one of the things that we've done on the publicly available platform, where you can see this and all these other series, is disaggregate it so we can see not just what's happening nationally, but what's happening in different states and even counties across the country. So let me show you a map here. This just takes the average of student engagement in the 6 or 7 weeks in the spring after the pandemic hit. And this is a heat map. So the bluer a state is, the better off they were doing in terms of this measure of engagement. And what you see is that some states like Connecticut is a good example. Rhode Island, where I am right now, did pretty well by this measure, actually saw a growth in Zern usage. And just to be clear, that doesn't mean that students were learning more than they were, but at least schools were able to perhaps even substitute into this online learning, which was a little bit easier when students were remote, substituting away from some of the more in-person stuff that they would have done normally. In contrast, you see some of the states, especially in the South, Mississippi Valley, doing really just extreme fall off. And if you look into what happened in many of these states, right, this isn't just about them deciding to focus on one thing as opposed to focusing on this particular program. In many of these states, learning just completely collapsed, and schools, basically became optional, and then nobody was doing anything for months in the spring in a way that led to really, really widespread learning loss that I think are driving some of the very large numbers we see in Emma's slides. But still, this is not a uniform thing. So even zooming into Louisiana, this is a parish level map of the same thing in Louisiana, right? So you see that most of the state is this deep red where things just completely collapse. But you see a number of parishes down here. So for instance, this long, thin one is Jefferson Parish. This is St. Charles Parish. This kind of just is very near New Orleans. And this is an example of a parish that kind of bucked what was the most of what was going on in the state, where the state was really advising people to just kind of back off and make everything optional. And in Jefferson Parish, they really did a number of, I think, quite interesting things to keep learning going. And you really see the results of that in the engagement that students had in these data. So let me return to what's been happening in the fall. So we saw that things were better, but not back to par in the fall. So why is that the case? To what extent can that be chalked up to the fact that many schools are still remote? And even though they had time to plan, right, maybe being remote is still not quite getting us where we need to be. And I think Zern is actually a really interesting data point for this, because in some sense, again, it's not going to capture all of learning, But from a remote learning perspective, right, again, if you could do anything, you'd think that this would be something you could do. So I really view this as kind of a canary in the coal mine, that if schools can't get this right, then we really would think that there are going to be broader problems. So we've looked at these data in two different ways. The first way that we've looked at these data is just to take schools that returned remotely versus in person in the fall. So this is just, some places came back remotely, some places came back in person. Now, that pattern was very different in different parts of the country, and so we're only comparing schools here to other schools in the same region to kind of take out some of these very large differences. What you see here is, I think, a pretty striking pattern where in lighter blue, these are schools that came back remote in the fall. They were actually doing somewhat better in the spring, but then they're much lower in the fall. Whereas the schools that came back in person in the fall, they were not doing so well last spring, but they actually did manage to basically get back to where they were before when they came back in person. And so this suggests to me that a lot of what's going on really is still being driven by the continued prevalence of remote schooling. We can look at this in an even finer way by not just looking at schools that were in person versus remote for all of the fall, but for schools that started out in person and then had to go back to remote as a result of the recent, very serious COVID-19 spikes in the last 6 weeks. And so if you just look at what happens kind of literally week to week when schools go back to being remote, here's the graph you get. So the light blue are schools that went back to being remote, whereas the dark blue-green, those are schools in the same state where they looked pretty similar before, but then they were able to stay in person. And so you see that there is a little bit of a gap, maybe a 10 percentage point gap right before these schools go remote, but that more than doubles. And so again, it really seems like staying in remote for the fall, being forced to go back to remote as a result of this recent outbreak, this really is driving the continued loss in education. And I think, obviously this is not the only factor that we want to consider, but my reading of these data is it really points towards getting kids back to school as quickly as can be done safely as really the key policy to try to first just stop these learning losses and then start to recover these gains.
Well, very helpful. Let me just ask a clarifying question if I can. So the measure of engagement that you were using here is participation in this program, Zern, which is an online program. So you're using it essentially as a proxy for like how much schooling, how much educational content can kids get. And so what's interesting here is even though we would assume that kids could be able to access this online platform from home, when schools closed down, they did so less. And actually, when they went back to school, or schools that had more kids in school, especially in the fall, they were actually engaged more than the ones who were still at home. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And we've actually looked at a number of different measures. One way to look at it is just how many students are engaging at all on a weekly basis. We can do it more finely as well by looking at essentially how much progress, how many lessons are students working through. To get some sense not just of whether they're engaged, but are they engaged at the same rate? You really get the same message from either approach. And I think as you mentioned, it's almost a little bit surprising that students are more engaged in this online learning tool when they're in person in school. But my sense is that it's not just that it's easier to get to Zern when you're out of school. It's that this is all part of, not just like a robotic, like, do I do task A or do I do task B as a student, but it's a classroom learning environment where teachers are just much less able to create a learning environment where people can focus on the material, make progress, and when they're out of school. And so as a result, it seems like even this online learning tool is really much more of a complement to being in school than a substitute.
Well, thank you for that. It is a little bit worrisome, but I think it goes to this point that you made at the end, maybe how important just the blunt intervention of get as many kids back in classroom as possible, as quickly as possible, in a safe way. This is a theme that just keeps coming up everywhere. Okay, enough of my editorializing. I think, Nat, you're next.
Yeah, you bet. Glad to be here. Let me bring my slideshow up. All right, I'm hoping you can see that, Andy. Tell me if not. So at AEI, me and my team have done quite a bit of work just trying to track what schools have been doing over the fall or over the spring and into the fall. And so I'm just going to sort of go over some of the things we found that point to how this unfolded and how these problems are going. Again, this is mostly data gathered from what districts are putting on, had put on their websites. But I think to start out, what animates this whole question for me is a broader context that was here before the pandemic. So these are 12th grade NAEP math numbers. These came out recently. This is all pre-pandemic. And it doesn't seem like there's a lot of action here, but what you can see is that the lower scoring students in the orange and light blue bars on the bottom at the 10th and 25th percentile, they are seeming to slide over time, where the rest...
I'm sorry to interrupt. We can't see your slides. Is there a different way to share content?
I need you to see my slides. Let me try this again. Can you see that, Andy?
Yes.
Perfect.
Everyone else good? Great. Thanks, Nat.
You bet. Okay, so back to the context. So basically what we're seeing here is the lower scoring students in the 10th and 25th percentile over these years in NAEP, they're sort of sliding further down, and the higher scoring students are sort of staying on par, not really increasing. And what we're just seeing is a widening of the absolute achievement gap. That trend is also evident in 8th grade NAEP math scores. You can just see it's yawning a bit. And that pre-pandemic context really matters, because I'm afraid that gap is going to yawn dramatically as a result of the pandemic and the emergency learning from the spring and the losses that stem from it. And I think that just animates these concerns. So at AEI, we gathered data on a nationally representative group of 250 districts. We gathered data 6 times across the spring, from March 27th through the end of May. And we followed them also up in the beginning of the year. And this displays the instructional platforms that were offered then. And you can see sort of a general picture of what happened. Blue and orange represent districts offering instructional packets. That's printouts and worksheets students are taking home. The asynchronous, you can think Google Classroom or Blackboard or some similar platform that allows teachers to push content out to students on the internet. And that rose dramatically, sort of plateaued in May. And then gray here is the synchronous platforms we see. And I think what's striking about this is that it just is a little bit jarring compared to the typical picture of what we think about in remote learning. You know, you see the magazine photo of the kid with a set of headphones on, participating in Zoom. And that picture is just not really representative of most of the learning that was going on in the spring. Districts, by what they posted on their websites, just many of them did not offer that systematically to students. We found these offerings also varied by student characteristics. Those districts that relied primarily on online platforms, that would be Zoom or asynchronous platforms, were much more often low poverty than high poverty, and much more often high achieving. One interesting thing is that the differences by minority composition of districts that we're so used to associating with gaps by poverty and achievement at least weren't evident in these offerings. And actually the numbers were sort of flipped to a small degree. So when you look at back at this graph, a lot of times our eyes are sort of drawn to this horse race, right? Where did districts get to in these offerings? Where did they end up at? And that's fine and interesting, but I think a really important question to gauge, well, what was the quality of the offerings in the spring was sort of the area under the curve, right? It took a long time for these schools to ramp up, and as they did, students went without learning. So you can think about these same percentages in the 80s and 40s in the blue bars here, but because we were able to gather the data, sort of every couple of weeks, we could calculate the amount of the entire post-closure period that these were available to all students. And these are much lower percentages. So about 2/3 of the remainder of the year after closures, instructional packets and asynchronous learning was available to students. And again, the typical picture of remote learning, this synchronous instruction was really available a fairly small proportion of the time. So it's hard to see that as a glass half full. Of course, the concern over instructional time that was lost is important here. These are the number of days between when closure announcements came down and when districts started offering any kind of remote instruction, not the full-fledged platform. And that was on average about 8 days, and these are displayed by district levels of poverty. And it didn't vary appreciably. But these canceled days are not the only source of lost instructional time. So we used some survey data taken at 3 different points across the spring, and that was also disaggregated by student poverty. And those are the percentage of students teachers said were just not participating. And when you chalk those numbers up as a percentage of lost time, you get a much larger proportion, even than the days when schools were shuttered, not buildings, but just not offering an instruction. And it's substantially worse for higher poverty districts. These may not seem like a ton of time, 3 or 4 weeks of school, but when there was on average about 55 days of school in these districts remaining after closure announcements, that's a pretty big chunk of lost instructional time. We followed up these districts when they reopened. So each district was surveyed during the week that it opened doors or not, as the case may be, and found about 41% of schools were coming back in person, about a quarter hybrid, and about a third remote. And we saw stark differences by district minority percentage, poverty, and achievement history, where low minority districts, low poverty districts, and high achieving districts were just much more likely to be in person or hybrid compared to other districts. We also looked back at these districts on October 1st, and it's important to note that in a lot of these districts, the time period between reopening and October 1st was much shorter than in others. But we saw pretty remarkable shifts over just the brief time, especially decreases in remote-only options, which went from about a third to about a quarter of schools. And we also looked by blue, purple, and red states by their voting histories since 2000. And first of all, we saw stark differences in reopening with districts in blue states or schools in blue states much more likely to be remote and very unlikely to be in person. And we also saw shifts in that over time by October 1st. Interestingly, the districts we had in purple states barely moved at all. There was some move in blue states towards hybrid, and then in red states, there was just a large growth in both in-person and hybrid movements. One note of good news, to whatever degree that is, when we contrasted between what we found in May, that remote school districts, which were all of them, were relying on, just about 60% of them were relying mostly on online platforms. That's either asynchronous or synchronous instruction. Some good news is that by September at school reopening, the vast proportion of schools were relying on online platforms. And I don't want to say that that is necessarily indicative of high quality instruction, but at least we're clearing a low bar for remote instruction. So briefly, what we're doing now is trying to track a large number of districts every week. This is not nationally representative yet. It represents about 1,100 school districts, and we're trying to build that sample up quickly. The district status just this month has shifted primarily with a growth in districts that are remote only. And it's important throughout this to keep your eye on the unit of analysis, because we can shift the same district shifting status map to the school level. And you see that the remote only districts are just much larger. They have more schools. And so the percentage of schools that is remote only has grown much more rapidly because of those large districts. And this would shift again if you looked at schools, because the schools in that group also, or if you looked at the number of students, the schools in that group also look, are larger. So we'll continue to sort of track this to try and describe how schools are moving as the pandemic progresses. With that, I will send it back to you, Andy.
So let me, if you don't mind, just ask one follow-up question. And I should say for the people watching, if you have any questions, please use the chat function and send them to me. I'll be monitoring that. So after Robin gives her presentation, we can open this up and I'll get your thoughts into the bloodstream. Okay, so Nat, and feel free to say we just don't know enough about this, but it's something that's been on my mind, like predicting which districts could have or should have or did end up doing a better job transitioning to remote online kind of learning when all this happened. At first, I started thinking, well, obviously it's going to be the big districts. They have the biggest central offices. They have the most sort of like operational dollars, administration. They have the most staff. They'll do it quickly. But then I started seeing CMOs that were nimbler, even though they were small. They kind of had more degrees of freedom so they could get it done. And then I thought, well, maybe it could be just any district that has a longer experience doing some kind of online learning. So everything I've looked at, like none of my hypotheses, I can't find proof for any of these things. Just based on what you've seen, do we have any reason to believe certain characteristics or certain habits or past experiences in districts would lead us to believe they were able to shift more quickly, or when they shifted, they did a better job?
So I think Robin's actually got better answers for that than I do. So I will punt that question quickly to her. I will say one of the things that we saw to be fairly determinative was broadband access. It's just a big problem, especially in rural districts where it is much lower, and that had a disproportionate influence both in the spring on what they offered and how quickly they could get any sort of asynchronous or synchronous platform up and running, and also their reopening plans this fall. Just simply put, if they had lower broadband access, they felt the pressure to get back in person. And
interesting.
Yeah, in some way that might be putting a disadvantage to an advantage to the degree that reopening is beneficial and safe.
Great. Well, Robin, good transition, I guess.
Yeah, I'll add on to that. I think we're still learning and sort of unpacking what factors really contributed to fast and effective moves, but a few things that have jumped out to us. First, there's just a real leadership story here. In chaos, in crisis, leadership really matters. Effective mobilization of your team and getting everybody on the same page. But you can't do that without strong relationships. And so we do think that effective trust between labor and management and good effective working relationships previous to the pandemic were real factors. And then we're also wondering about centralization versus decentralization. More centralized systems tended to move more quickly and effectively because they had a centralized curriculum, that kind of thing, and decentralized systems. There was a little bit more chaos, a little bit more kind of pushback around what are we doing here. On the other hand, more opportunity for innovation in decentralized systems.
That's great. Thank you.
So shall I jump into my slides?
Please.
Let me see if I can share them. All right, I'm just going to go for this strategy.
Looks good.
Does it? Great. How exciting. Okay, so I'm going to move pretty quickly through some data. Some of it may repeat a little bit of the story that you all have heard already, but I'll be drawing from a few different data points. We've been tracking since the beginning of the pandemic school district responses akin to what NAT is doing. We have been looking at the 100 largest school districts in the country plus a representative sample, and we've corralled a bunch of researchers around the country, nearly 200 now, to just share data. I won't flood you with all of it. I'll just give you a little bit of a sample. And I'll start with what I think, if I had to kind of summarize what the heck happened over the last 10 months, this is how I'd boil it down. It was not pretty in the spring. It's probably quite an understatement. And with very notable exceptions, the onus of responsibility for educating kids really fell to families. I think you've already seen some data to that point. But I'll just add that as we moved out of spring and districts started kind of getting out of the mode of, oh, this is just 2 weeks, this is just another month, they spent the summer for the most part planning for in-person instruction in the fall. And alas, when the fall came, many of them had to default to the remote instruction environment, which they really hadn't planned for. They had done some, but the complexities of trying to get back to in-person instruction really consumed them. So I think that's just important context to know about kind of what was in districts' heads, what they were thinking about, and why, though remote instruction has been better this year, it's still quite messy. And just an observation that I think we are still in kind of a course of what we're trying to call a currency of denial, where we're grasping at the possibility of reopening and not dealing with the fundamentals of really delivering on remote instruction. And so that is just preamble to, I agree with you all that we all want schools to reopen. In the meantime, we've got to figure out creative ways to educate kids more effectively. And then I won't get into too much of the data on the spring. Just a few data points from us around the extent to which districts just really didn't expect teachers to teach and really put the onus of responsibility on families, shifted away from attendance and grading standards was pretty notable. Just another look at the synchronous versus asynchronous instruction, and we're blown away by this no instruction category in the spring, where teachers were left to their own decision-making process about whether they would offer actual instruction, live instruction to kids. Here I'm pulling from some polling data, and we've really talked a lot about the technology gap, and so I won't get into these numbers very much. I will just say that as we think about the technology gap, that's something that to some degree was outside of school districts' control. Some of them moved quickly, some of them didn't. But what we saw less of from districts in the spring was really something that was in their control, which is figuring out how to get teachers prepared to educate by whatever means possible. And that played out in very, inequitable ways. It goes to the same old story that we've known for many, many years, that inequity is kind of hardwired into our school systems. And here you can see it playing out for some survey results that Rand put together about the type of support teachers were getting for remote instruction. Okay, so I'll just switch over to the fall, and this is just another look at kind of how rapidly districts started moving toward remote instruction at the very last minute, and scrambling to figure out how to do it well yet again. As others have said, things are looking better on many fronts in terms of remote instruction. I will say too that, though they're looking better, they're looking very traditional. So what districts tended to do was kind of repeat what they knew, the bell schedule, the coursework, the instructional strategies even. So even though there was more live instructional time, was it being used really effectively? Probably not. And so that might be part of what's going on in the data. Here, grading and attendance, looking better. And we've really zoomed in on some of the most vulnerable kids in our data. And here we're taking a look at commitment to special needs English language learners. A lot of the reopening plans that we reviewed are paying, at least basic attention. I will point out the negative here that what this chart is showing you is that more than 10% of districts in our data didn't even mention kids with special needs in their reopening plans, and even more didn't even mention English language learners. So there's that. And then when we get under the hood here a little bit, though there's mention, there's very little in the way of what we know to be effective strategies for catching up kids, especially the most vulnerable learners. So others have mentioned tutoring strategies and assessments and diagnostic assessments, interventions that we know are effective. We're just seeing very, very little on that front, at least in what districts are saying they're doing. And then in terms of supporting teachers, here, just another thing that is in district's control, but really hasn't come to fruition. Just, the amount of attention to really amping up the supports to teachers over summer, providing more time for collaboration, planning, effective coaching strategies, which I know is the best way to support teachers, just were a little to be desired. I'll move toward closing out the data, which is a little glimpse into some of the state data that we've been tracking for all you state policymakers. What we saw when we looked across states and their guidance or requirements to districts was that they were very hands-off for the most part. States were staying away from requirements, which you can see in the royal blue here, around accelerating learning, assessments, providing real specific practices about how to support remote learning in particular. Many of them really didn't require districts to plan for multiple scenarios. So I just want to point out, we haven't talked about states very much, but that kind of hands-off attitude has been, I think, quite problematic. And here I'll just shift to a factor that has just recently come on our radar. We started studying what's going on, not switching away from the state level and going to the very, very local level. What's going on in pods and learning hubs? We're seeing across the country impressive examples of community groups really rising to the occasion and finding kind of third way solutions between in-person learning and remote learning. So bringing the most vulnerable learners back into spaces, whether they're churches or whatever, and providing really innovative supports to those kids. So hopefully we'll see more of that, and I think states could do more to encourage that. As we look to the fall, look to the remainder of this year. We, as Nat is doing, are tracking here the urban districts, and you can see there's kind of a slow crawl back to in-person learning. We think that's stalling out. As you can see in our most recent data here, the phased reopenings are kind of slowing down. There were a lot of plans for those, and they're starting to pull back on them. We think we're about to see a big rise again in the urban districts moving back to remote learning. And finally, just to point out that despite the fact that we do want kids to be back in schools, there is a significant number of families who are saying over and over again, we're not going back until there's a vaccine. So again, let's not focus all of our attention on getting back into schools. So do you want to, Andy, do you want me to stop here and we can get to kind of thoughts about where we go from here?
Yeah, if you don't mind, we only have, I don't know, maybe 10 minutes left. So let me just give a question. And Robin, if you want to take the first swing at it, go ahead. Or if you want to pass, fine. But I want to make sure that we're trying to be as much benefit to the people watching as possible. And so I want to give all of you a promotion to the superintendent of schools of whatever state you are sitting in right now. So let me do a little bit of like throat clearing to give you some time to think about this. Given that I've worked for a bunch of government entities, I have a tendency to be really sympathetic to the claims of a lot of these leaders who have said, listen, we have been doing our best. We weren't trained to figure out how to go and deal with a pandemic, to go from brick and mortar to online. We had to deal with unions and we had to deal with civil service roles and transportation. We were doing our best. So I always want to make sure that in a conversation like this, we don't make educators and these policymakers feel like all we're doing is blaming them. They had a once in a century thing thrust upon them, and they've done a great job in many cases, or at least they've done the best that they could under the situation. But we're now, 8, 9, 10 months into this, and it's time for, Robin, as you said, states are ultimately responsible for public education under their constitution. State leaders got to step up. So at some point, imagine the governor, the chairs of the legislative committees in whatever state you're in come to you as a state superintendent like tomorrow. And they say, our legislature is really going to kick off into high gear in January for our new session. And we want to put together a package to deal with what has already happened with the pandemic and looking forward. You, Madam, Mr., Dr., Superintendent, give us 3, 4, 5 ideas that we can put into this legislative package. We have the benediction of leadership of both parties. We're going to come together and get this done. But you as a state leader have to tell us what we need to do. Robin, do you want to take a swing? What are the couple things you would tell that governor, those legislative chairs? What do they need to do now?
Sure, I can start. I mean, I would start with what we know works for kids who need to catch up, and that's tutoring. And I would go big on to begin a virtual tutoring program until we can get more face-to-face interventions. There's a lot you can do virtually. The UK has a national tutoring program. It's proving to be pretty effective. I would just go big. I think Tennessee is a good example that one could look to. I would, secondly, go big on assessments. And that is a tricky one in this environment, but ensuring that every district is running a diagnostic assessment and making the results available in some way to be really clear about what learning loss looks like and getting that information to families so families can hold folks accountable. And the last thing I would do is make money available to encourage these kind of third way solutions where most vulnerable kids are getting what they need as much as possible. We've got to put the power in the hands of families and communities to be able to solve their own problems right now.
Fantastic. Love it. Let me just press on one of those things. I don't want to put words into your mouth, but I think state policymakers are going to be thinking about, do we hold off on state assessments this year? Do we hold off next year? Do we keep doing the state assessments, but then don't do interventions? Do you have a position on state tests this year or next year?
Yeah, I mean, I think if at all feasible, run the state test. No, they're going to be completely imperfect, but some information is better than no information. On accountability, the stakes are very, very high for kids, and we can't let people off the hook. However, it's a tricky one. So I definitely have some ideas about how accountability systems can work right now, and I think it really needs to focus on transparency to know whether schools are doing what we know works for kids. So while I don't tend to focus accountability on process right now, I think process actually really matters. High quality curriculum, high quality interventions, and supports for kids.
That's awesome. Emma, thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. I would double down on the tutoring. As Robin said, there have been studies that show that these high intensity tutoring approaches can actually help kids catch up an additional 1 to 2 years of mathematics over what they would normally learn over the course of a year. And so that could help them catch up the COVID slide. I would say the second thing, in addition to tutoring, is really think innovatively about what we want to do next summer. Hopefully by June, we will have at least some proportion of the population vaccinated. How can we think creatively around the summer? There have been acceleration academies tested where students have gained 3 months of reading learning in a week. How can we roll that out so that every student can catch up? Even though the reading loss is less, it's there. And so how can we help think about the summer and think about tutoring to help kids catch up?
Fantastic. John?
So I also agree on the tutoring, but I actually just want to take a step back and kind of reframe the way that you asked the question. So you said, wow, like principals weren't prepared. This was like a once in 100-year thing. And yes, I think if you think about it narrowly, like people probably had not thought about how to get hotspots to students at homes with internet before. They hadn't thought about a global pandemic. But I actually think from a broader perspective, dealing with disruptions to learning is probably not something that principals deal with like every single day for all the students at many kind of very high functioning schools for rich students in affluent neighborhoods. But this is something that is at the core of what many schools deal with when they're dealing with students whose backgrounds for whatever reason are not fully supporting what they're doing in school. And even though the particular problems that they're responding to are different, my sense from looking at the data is that the schools which, over the last 10 years have been much more effective at creating the environment where students from broken homes, from, very poor environments, low-funded schools, the schools that have been successful in helping those students learn were also the schools that were much better in terms of responding to the pandemic initially in the spring. And they continue to be much better in the fall. So, just to give you an example, and if you look at, this is a very crude measure, but if you look at, growth scores for schools across the country, very highly correlated with the way in which these schools have responded to the pandemic. And so I think that, supporting students and schools with, funding and some of these broad proposals is right. But I also think that as Emma said, like empowering principals, local leaders to think creatively and figure out like what is it that the students in this particular situation need? How do we deal with these problems in the past? How can we look to schools that have been successful at dealing with this and other difficulties locally and generate ideas to think about how we can help our own students? I actually think that we should actually normalize what's going on here and think about this as a problem to be overcome in the course of education, as schools overcome many problems in the course of educating kids all the time.
That's great. Nat? Oh, I think you're muted.
I am muted.
Yep.
There we go. Someone was unmuting me while I muted myself. I like the idea of the tutoring in theory. I worry about it in practice. I mean, it's hard enough to launch these things, just typical teaching approaches efficaciously with students that have variable levels of engagement. And the kids that will need the tutoring the most will be those that are suffering with disengagement. And so there's just a question of, do we have the technology to deliver that tutoring effectively? Maybe, but I do think that the best technology that we can bring to bear on this situation is open school buildings. It's a very simple technology. It's the fastest way to get back. Hopefully vaccines will bring about some ability to do that by the end of the school year. I'd love to see Q4 look much different than the direction we're heading now. And, you know, for state leaders, I think that one of the things that they need to do is admit that, you know, one of the biggest learning losses since the beginning of this pandemic was any scientific way to measure how we can operate schools during the pandemic. We have not been serious about figuring out how to do that. We have not gathered the data necessary to lock down what the transmission dangers are in schools, how long we need to quarantine folks that are exposed, teachers that thus present staffing problems. I think over the next several months, deliberate plans to try and understand those aspects and build a argument and a safe path to getting more students, especially elementary students, back in school is both feasible and has been sorely lacking.
Okay, that's great. So we're almost out of time, so let's do this. I want to give each of you the chance to say a final word if you'd like, but I also want to raise a question that may be on the minds of some legislators or policymakers at the state level, which is this. There are three different ways to think about doing any kind of program, whether tutoring or otherwise, just in terms of like system involvement. One would be, say you have $10 million and you want kids to get better educated, you just funnel the money through your traditional school formula and it goes down to districts and they control the money. A second way to do it is say, well, districts haven't solved all these problems. We need to be more pluralistic, more entrepreneurial, more innovative about this. We're going to create a statewide competitive grant program, enable districts and nonprofits and even for-profits to come up with ways to solve this problem. The final mode is something that Robin alluded to that may be the most interesting thing I think that's happened over the past year, which is kind of the spontaneous, organic families just kind of figuring stuff out. And this would be, you say, all right, we're going to put this money into an education tax credit program or some sort of like pod funding where families can organically figure these things out and create a market on their own. So any of you can respond to that or just spend your minute saying whatever you think the viewers need to know and think about over the next, I don't know, call it legislative session. Let's go in reverse order. Robin, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think I played my card on this. I really think that there's really important stuff being done in these hubs and pods. They're not completely off the grid. They're, you know, YMCAs, and they're bringing mental health supports and other enrichment activities and things to kids in new ways that are really important. And so, yes, I think that, you know, funding to support that with some guardrails, of course, around what that looks like. But the reason that it's important is it provides a third-way solution right now for families who don't feel safe going back or whose schools remain closed. And it allows us to learn about how to build a better normal, because normal is what got us into this mess. We've got to figure out strategies right now for rebuilding over the next 2 years is going to, you know, kind of create the foundations and define what normal will be from here on out. Let's use this time.
Great. Emma?
Yeah, so I think in my sense, I think any of the channels could work, but I think that we need to have three kind of criteria or guiding principles. And the first is we need to think about resources to the students who need it most. Some students are coming out of this just fine. Let's focus on those that aren't. The second is not just focusing on the academics, which has obviously been our focus here, but on the whole child. This pandemic has had implications on nutrition, on mental health, on social emotional, the whole thing. And we need to look across that. And then the third is we need to measure and adjust, and we need better data to be able to do that, to make better decisions as we go forwards.
Great, thank you. John?
So I think the most important thing overall is getting kids back to school. I think that kind of tinkering around the margins of how to make remote learning better is going to be a half margin at best. And, this is not an epidemiology session, but my sense of the best data recently is that schools, especially for elementary school students, are not, vectors of social spread, relative to almost anything else that people do interacting socially, right? It's not obvious why getting kids together at the YMCA is less, harmful than getting kids together at the school. My sense is this is totally like a social preferences thing. And so I think that's number one. And, to the extent that more funding is required to make that happen sooner rather than later, I think that's a first order thing. Then I would go to what Emma mentioned, where we really need data on achievement and, where kids are in an individualized way so that we can target the type of supports, whether they be tutoring or other resources, to get them back up to where they need to be, right? This is not something, even if we could snap our fingers and have every kid back in school learning just as they were on January 1st, that is not going to solve the problem that we've dug this enormous hole that many students are going to have to climb out of. And so even once we get kids back in school, we're going to need the resources to target these approaches to not just close, but hopefully use this to build a system that, drives more kind of equitable learning across different types of students.
Fantastic. Thank you. All right, Nat, you get the last word.
Well, I don't know if I've got a last word because they took all the words that I would use, but I'll definitely back what John was saying. I think first we need to stop the bleeding, right, before the healing process can begin, and it's going to be a long and tough healing process. And just to echo off of Emma, I don't think about this primarily as a learning problem. There's big learning issues, but children are suffering. There are lots and lots of second graders who haven't been in a school since March and haven't had much outside content or contact. And that's just a developmental disaster. And it keeps me up at night. Robin, I'm sort of like fund everything. I think it's an emergency. I think I'm throwing my fiscal conservatism out the window on this. I think it's an emergency, and we need to treat it as such now.
Well, let me say thank you to Nat and Emma and Robin and John. I feel a whole lot smarter now than I was an hour ago. So thank you for sharing all this with us. And thank you to the ExcelinEd team for putting this together, and for everyone who was watching there at home. Best of luck in the future, and take care, everyone. Happy holidays.